To the Technical Assistance Network for Children's Behavioral Health, Cultural and Linguistic Competence Peer Learning Exchange. The Peer Learning Exchange is a webinar or monthly topic focused on promoting health equity and eliminating disparities in child, youth, and young adult behavioral health. Topics are generated by you, individuals working in and being served by or partnering with behavioral health organizations and system of care, states, communities, tribes, and territories. The TA Network, as it is known, is part of the National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Children's Behavioral Health for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, commonly referred to as SAMHSA. My name is Selena Webster-Bass, CEO of the Voices Institute and a core partner of the Cultural and Linguistic Competence team of the TA Network. Today's webinar is titled Crossover Youth, Understanding the Pathways, Characteristics, Opportunities for Youth that Fluctuate Between Child Welfare and Juvenile Justice. This webinar is hosted by the Georgetown University Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, a partner in the National TA Network. This webinar is the final session in our Urban Mental Health series. This webinar will provide an overview of the crossover youth practice model developed by Georgetown University's Center for Juvenile Justice Reform as an evidence-based system reform model to impact this population. You will be provided with information concerning the characteristics of this population with a specific focus on behavioral health challenges, the pathways they follow into their involvement with the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and the implications of their experiences for systemic change. I am excited to welcome the experts that will be leading this important discussion today. Let me begin with introductions. Dr. Karen Kolovatsky is a research professor at the Howard University School of Social Work. Her areas of research focus on improving the understanding of youth that fluctuate between child welfare and juvenile justice, also known as crossover youth. She currently serves as a data consultant to the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, and in that role, she is responsible for evaluating the impact of the model in participating jurisdictions. Our second facilitator is Dr. Alex Miller, Program Manager at Georgetown University's Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. As Program Manager, Dr. Miller oversees the development, evaluation, and implementation of the crossover youth practice model. Prior to joining the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, Dr. Miller earned her PhD in Special Education from the University of Virginia Curry School of Education and Human Development, where her research focused on youth with disabilities in the juvenile justice system.
Thank you so much, Selena. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Miller, and as Selena mentioned, my colleague Karen Kolovatsky and I will be discussing the characteristics of crossover youth, how they may become involved in the juvenile justice and child welfare systems, their outcomes, and a framework that was created to support this population. So before we really dive into things, I think it's important that we all understand who crossover youth are. So I'm going to briefly run through a few terms that are used to describe this population. This list came out of a study from Cal State LA, and we're encouraging the field to adopt these terms as we look to define this population of young people. So crossover youth is an umbrella term often used to describe any youth who engages in delinquent acts who has experienced maltreatment, regardless of whether or not they have had any formal contact with the juvenile justice or child welfare systems. Dual system youth is a more narrow definition of crossover youth because it describes youth who have formally touched the child welfare and juvenile justice systems in some way. Dual contact youth are a subset of dual system youth who have non-concurrent involvement with both systems. In other words, they may be adjudicated in the justice system and have a previous case that is now closed with child welfare. The phrase dually involved youth indicates that youth have had concurrent involvement with both systems, which can include investigations or further involvement in either system. And finally, duly adjudicated youth are a subset of the duly involved group and describe those who are most deeply entrenched in the two systems in that they are adjudicated in both the juvenile justice and child welfare systems. For the purposes of our discussion today, we will use the terms crossover youth and dual system youth as they provide a broader scope of this population. There are 4 dominant pathways by which young people can become dual system youth. The first pathway is when an individual has an open child welfare case and becomes involved with the juvenile justice system, thus making their involvement with both agencies concurrent. The second pathway occurs when a young person who becomes involved with the justice system has a historical case with the child welfare system, meaning it is not currently open and thus their involvement with both agencies is non-concurrent. Pathway 3 is when a youth enters the justice system and is subsequently referred to the child welfare system due to discovery or suspicion of maltreatment. And finally, the fourth pathway is when a young person is leaving the justice system but does not have a home to return to and is thus referred to child welfare. The first and second pathways are by far the most common that we see in the crossover work that we've done. And of those two, pathway 1 has been the most dominant. This is also the trend that we see in national data, which is why it's been identified as pathway number 1.
And so next, I'll talk a little bit more about characteristics of dual system youth. And what I just want to do is take the opportunity to thank our hosts for having us today, as well as you for joining in and learning a little bit more about crossover youth. So in terms of their characteristics of kind of who this population is and what they look like, these are the results from 2 studies, one of which is just actually the first to get national numbers on crossover youth. And so one of the first things I'll talk about is that girls are represented at higher rates. We often think of delinquency as being prevalent among boys, and while this is true, what we find in crossover cases, or as we mentioned, young people who move between child welfare and juvenile justice, girls actually tend to be overrepresented more. One of the other things we look at when we're looking at describing this population is looking at their child welfare system histories. And what we know from these 2 studies is that youth spent over 5 years in child welfare and averaged 10 referrals to the system, referrals meaning for abuse or neglect if they were a crossover youth. So these are young people who have extensive, often experiences in the child welfare system before moving to the juvenile justice system. Regarding race, African American youth are overrepresented. Roughly 43% of duly involved youth in the sample specific to these studies were African American. And so just to provide some kind of context of kind of what that means, specifically for one site in LA, in 2016, African American youth accounted for 7.4% of the child population in general in Los Angeles, 13% of child abuse and neglect reports, and then 29% of the foster care population. And that African American youth who are duly involved at 6 times these general population numbers. I'll talk more a little bit about that, all of these things kind of as we go further on. But just to give some kind of overview related to behavioral health and what we're looking at. For these specific studies, 75% of youth in the sample were diagnosed with a mental health issue, and half were receiving mental health services at the time of arrest. So again, I'll be talking more in depth about some behavioral health issues among this population and kind of the lack of services receipt at times. One of the other things when we're describing crossover youth is we want to know about their previous juvenile justice system contact. And what we generally know is that about 1/3 of youth have prior arrests. So in terms of prior contact with the juvenile justice system, they have on average 1.7 prior charges and 3 status offenses. And status offenses are those that are only considered against the law for when it's a young person and not an adult, such as underage drinking. A new area that's really emerging is related to making sure we're addressing and describing the needs of LGBTQ and gender nonconforming youth when we talk about crossover youth. What we do know is that this population, the subpopulation, is really represented at higher rates. So LGBTQ and gender nonconforming youth tend to be overrepresented. It can be difficult to gather a precise number, but it's estimated that at least 20% of crossover youth identify as such. And these youth tend to be removed from the home at higher rates than their heteronormative peers and are 7 times more likely to be placed in a congregate care setting. So next I'll talk a little bit about some of their child welfare system experiences of a young person who's involved in the child welfare and juvenile justice system. So a lot of times people want to know if there's a specific type of maltreatment that tends to kind of be the focus of a crossover youth, the typical crossover youth. And studies really vary, but what they kind of show across the board is that child welfare investigations are usually most likely for neglect. And I think this is true of just the child welfare population in general, but also shown in the crossover youth population. And then this tends to be followed by physical abuse and then sexual abuse. So I'll be talking a little bit about results from this kind of first national study that OJJDP funded study in which they looked at different sites. So some of those sites included Cook County, Illinois, and Cuyahoga County, which is in Ohio. So neglect tended to be kind of the most popular, followed by physical abuse, and then by sexual abuse, and specific in these jurisdictions. Another way that we can look at the child welfare experiences of dual system youth is to compare youth who are involved in both these systems to youth who are involved in the child welfare system only. And what we know when we're looking at out-of-home placements in the child welfare system is that out-of-home placements are noticeably greater for dual system youth than for youth who are only involved in the child welfare system. So in Cook County, dual system youth were almost 1.5 times more likely to be placed in out-of-home placement. And this was also shown in Cuyahoga County in New York City, where dual system youth were nearly twice as likely as their child welfare counterparts to receive placement of some type. We also know that crossover youth tend to have more out-of-home placements, and that when they are in out-of-home placements, they're spending a longer period of time in those settings compared to a young person who's only in the child welfare system. So on average, they experience 1 to 2 more placements and spend nearly an additional year, again, in placements compared to a young person who only is involved in the child welfare system. When we think about their long-term outcomes in the child welfare system, they're more likely to have open cases and are actually less likely to be adopted than young people in the child welfare system only.
So when we think about crossover youth and their experiences in the juvenile justice system, again, it's helpful to kind of use justice-only involved youth as a yardstick. And so what we've seen is that the outcomes for crossover youth, they tend to have worse outcomes in the juvenile justice system as compared to those only involved in the justice system. So for instance, dual system youth are more likely to undergo pre-adjudication detention regardless of the risk that they pose to the public. A common reason for this is that crossover youth may not have a parent or a stable adult in their lives who they can be released to. Additionally, these young people are more likely to have a delinquency petition filed with juvenile court, and they're less likely to qualify or be recommended for diversion than their justice-only peers. Crossover youth also tend to have a higher rate of recidivism than their peers, and they're more likely to be charged with person offenses, although less than half of the crimes that they do commit are violent crimes. A trend we've seen, though, in working with crossover youth is that they often commit these types of offenses in environments that they otherwise wouldn't experience if they weren't crossover youth, such as being engaged in congregate care settings. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, crossover youth are more likely to be held in detention prior to adjudication than their non-crossover peers. These young people are also less likely to qualify or be recommended for diversion programs, as I mentioned, and instead they face formal processing at higher rates. This is often attributed to the perception that dual system youth don't have a reliable adult in their lives, and thus they won't have the support that they'll need to complete requirements for diversion. After formal processing, we see crossover youth penetrate even deeper into the juvenile justice system, as they're more likely to be assigned placement in a group facility than receive probation in the community. We know that the deeper a young person is in the juvenile justice system, the bleaker their outcomes can be due to factors like a disruption to their education and further exposure to more deviant peers.
And so next, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the numbers related to crossover youth. There are a few different ways of how we count how many youth there are, depending on kind of what system we're looking at. So of course, there's going to be some variations in numbers due to a variety of factors, but hopefully these help give you a rough idea of some of the estimates that we have about how prevalent crossover youth are as a population. Looking across studies related to when we're thinking about the child welfare population, about 10 to 29% of youth over age 8 are subsequently arrested. And I'll talk more in depth about some studies that are related to that, but generally that's pretty consistent that it's roughly about this 30% number that we think of when we think about crossover youth. But again, some studies show more and some studies show less. Amongst juvenile justice referrals, or thinking about kind of that front-end juvenile justice system contact, in one study in King County, Washington, 67% of cases in juvenile justice had some kind of previous contact with the child welfare system. So looking at it that way, having about 2/3 of youth who had this previous contact with child welfare in juvenile justice is a very significant number. And crossover youth are underrepresented in diversion cases. So in the juvenile justice system, we want less youth to penetrate deeper into the juvenile justice system because it's probably not necessary for them. So there we'd like to really see higher numbers among crossover youth. Unfortunately, though, in a study of 4 Arizona counties, among the diversion population, only 1% were crossover youth. However, crossover youth represented 34% of all diversion cases in King County, Washington. So among cases in the juvenile justice system, so then looking at more kind of formal involvement when they're adjudicated or kind of opened for that formal involvement, in one study in New Mexico, crossover youth represented 35% of this population. And I'll talk more about kind of those last bullet points on the right about probation supervision and probation placement in those 4 Arizona counties on the next slide. And so first, one thing I wanted to note is that when we think about prevalence, is that these are likely very conservative numbers due to maltreated youth who may not have formal child welfare system contact or who engage in delinquency that isn't either self-reported or that necessarily comes to the attention of the juvenile justice authorities. So now I'll get more into kind of the prevalence amongst kind of juvenile crossover youth amongst juvenile justice. And so this arrow, I think, does a good job of really showing the increased prevalence of crossover youth the deeper you get into the juvenile justice system. Again, this is data from a study of 4 jurisdictions in Arizona. And ideally, we don't want youth getting heavily involved in kind of these deeper involvement in the juvenile justice system. However, when we look at the shallow end or front end involvement in juvenile justice, as I mentioned before, crossover youth make up only 1% of this group of youth. When we go in a little bit deeper into the juvenile justice system to look at the number of youth who get put on probation, that number goes up to 7%, meaning that there are 7% of crossover youth among youth on probation kind of in the sample. And then when we look at the deep end involvement of youth who are placed outside the home within the juvenile justice system, this number goes up to 42%. And then also from a study that I led, we found that the deeper into the juvenile justice system that crossover youth go, the higher the percentage of African American youth. And then in looking kind of on the converse, in groups of crossover youth who had some, but really not a lot of juvenile justice system involvement, there was a higher percentage of white youth. And so this really speaks to the need to really address disproportionate minority contact within the juvenile justice system.
So looking at long-term outcomes for crossover youth, there isn't a lot of research on the topic of long-term outcomes for this population. However, there is a growing literature base that suggests that these young people have worse outcomes than their peers involved only with the juvenile justice system or only with the child welfare system. 2 studies in particular that were conducted in New York City and Los Angeles examined factors related to crossover youth, including their reliance on or involvement with public services going into young adulthood. And what they found was that dual system youth were more likely to experience homelessness and unemployment, and they were also more likely to recidivate into the adult justice system. And as you can see here, close to 50% of crossover youth in both studies were reliant on or involved with 3 or more public services, which really indicates that their needs are not being met when they're in our care.
And so for the next section, I'm going to go into greater detail about the intersections of crossover youth specific to behavioral health needs and services. And so some of the information will be reiterating what's been said and also providing some additional detail. So I'll be talking about crossover youth, behavioral health, and race and gender differences. And then last, I'll talk about how mental health issues may vary by differences in how deep into the juvenile justice system that crossover youth get. So youth who have been victims of maltreatment and who engage in delinquency often have behavioral health issues that may continue from childhood into adulthood. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, crossover youth may have a range of mental health and or substance abuse issues, and that these numbers are higher than in the general population. This may be related to, one study found some families who have a history of mental health issues and or substance abuse. And when we think about estimates of serious emotional disturbances amongst this population, of youth who touch either the child welfare or the juvenile justice system, these numbers are very high, ranging from 40 to 86%, depending on kind of studies and how you define things. And that across the board, what we're seeing is that despite the high level of need, only small portions of youth who need those mental health and or substance abuse services are often actually receiving them. So it's an issue of accessing services as well as being aware of kind of the quality of services that we're providing as well. And so on this slide helps provide some of the information from before, just presented in a little bit different way and in a little bit more detail. So the pie chart on your left breaks down one study of youth with dual involvement in Los Angeles. And they found that across the board, 83% of young people who are crossover youth had at least one behavioral health issue. Of those, 28% had a mental health issue, but not a substance use issue. 17% had a substance use, but not mental health issue. And 38% had those co-occurring issues. So again, this really is demonstrating the evidence of needs amongst this population. And then another study of crossover youth practice model jurisdictions, or of those who have implemented the practice model that you'll be hearing more about later in this presentation, found that almost 2/3 of youth with dual involvement in child welfare and juvenile justice also had a mental health issue, and that 25% had demonstrated a substance use issue. So again, this speaks to the need of the importance of agencies to be able to communicate and collaborate, coordinate services to help ensure that crossover youth needs are being met. And this slide speaks to the discrepancies between what services youth were being referred to and then what percentage actually received those services that they needed, again, from a study in Los Angeles. So 75% of youth had diagnosed mental health challenges, 74% were referred to some form of individual therapy, but only 55% actually accessed this service. 43% referred to some type of academic tutoring, but only 17% were accessing this service. In terms of looking at psychotropic medication and medication monitoring, 1/3 were referred to receive this service, but only 15% actually accessed it. And so in addition to kind of considering whether you're receiving the medication, we also want to be aware that young people might not be actually taking it, and this is for a variety of reasons that we need to make sure and address. So just 50% of youth who were prescribed a psychotropic medication were found to actually be taking their medication. And so we know that the need for mental health and substance abuse services is present among crossover youth. So next, I just want to talk about addressing the question of how does that differ for different groups of youth. So I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about how behavioral health services for crossover youth vary by race and gender. And research has demonstrated that there are differences based on factors such as race and gender that play a role not only in youth who cross over from child welfare to the juvenile justice system, but again, also in receiving or not receiving mental health and substance abuse services as part of this. Also, there are systems level factors that are also at play regarding who is more likely to enter into the child welfare and juvenile justice systems in the first place that I think are important to acknowledge. So making sure we're also addressing on the front end kind of what youth are more likely to unnecessarily enter into these systems. Studies regarding mental health specifically tend to demonstrate that girls, especially adolescent girls, tend to focus on more internalizing their issues, so having like higher rates of depression, and that boys generally externalize it, so that's like engaging in substance use, acting out. This acting out gets interpreted as delinquency. And so specific to child welfare involved youth, researchers found that depression was associated with increased delinquency across time for girls, and that substance use was associated with increased delinquency in boys. And so we need to look at who is receiving what kind of services prior to crossing over between child welfare and juvenile justice, and to identify potential areas of intervention. So in the next few slides, I'll go into more specifics about how different groups are impacted differently by race and gender. And just to kind of reiterate that knowing more about who's receiving these services and kind of how can help us tailor our approaches to best meeting the needs of all crossover youth. So one important study that I want to highlight is by Goodkind and colleagues, and I was part of this research team, in which they used a sample of 17,000 child welfare involved youth. So these were young people who received both in-home and out-of-home services, as well as a subsample of 3,700 youth who received out-of-home services only, to examine how mental health and substance abuse services receipt related to subsequent juvenile justice involvement. And so they also examined whether this varied by race and gender. And the study was done in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, which is the metro area of Pittsburgh. So although Pittsburgh is now a CYPM site, just to note that this research took place prior to CYPM implementation there. And another thing to note is that they were only able to make comparisons between African American and white youth due to small sample sizes for other races and ethnicities. Additionally, they focused on mental health and substance abuse services receipt prior to juvenile justice system involvement, since many youth received such services upon contact with the juvenile justice system. So in this sample, 51% of youth received substance use services prior to juvenile justice contact, and 86% received some type of mental health services before contact with the juvenile justice system. Among youth who had an out-of-home placement, 68% received mental health services prior to any justice system involvement, and this number was 25% for substance abuse services. And these relatively high numbers indicate that many services offered to young people in child welfare care often really comes from involvement in behavioral health systems. So on the next slide, I'll talk more about the results from the regression analysis that they ran to examine kind of what was predicting juvenile justice system contact. And again, these included mental health and substance abuse services receipt, as well as kind of breaking it down by gender and by race. And so for that full sample that included both in-home and out-of-home youth, receiving mental health services was significantly related to juvenile justice system contact, and that this actually was the most important predictor of juvenile justice system contact. In examining the interaction effect of gender and race, so we know that these things operate kind of in tandem, receiving substance abuse services was related to a greater likelihood of juvenile justice system contact for white boys, but not for any other group. And for African American boys and for white girls, receiving substance abuse services was actually related to a slight decrease in the probability of juvenile justice system contact. And then on the right, among youth who received an out-of-home placement in the child welfare system, receiving mental health services was significantly associated with having juvenile justice system contact, whereas receiving substance abuse services was related to a decrease in juvenile justice system contact. And so one important limitation to note is that the measures for services don't account for variation in types of issues faced by youth, so this wasn't looking at severity or diagnosis of mental health issues, this was only looking at services receipts. And that these results suggest that mental health and substance abuse services may have a protective effect in youth not getting involved in the juvenile justice system for some youth, and that this also may be suggested of unmet need for substance abuse services in particular. So another way of looking at how young people's experiences with systems may vary is through looking at the variations of mental health service usage when considering that crossover youth have different depths of involvement in the juvenile and the criminal justice system, so looking at the adult system as well. So in other words, some youth get arrested at younger ages for things like status offenses, but might have no additional contact with the juvenile justice or subsequent criminal justice system, whereas others are consistently involved with the justice systems during adolescence and kind of into young adulthood. So the question then is, how does mental health service usage vary by the depth of justice system involvement that one experiences, again, among crossover youth? So to answer this question, first I'll address the issues of variations and levels of justice system involvement among child welfare youth. So this information is in the pie chart on the left. And just to give a little bit of background to this was a subsample from the previous Pittsburgh study. So this specific sample here was of youth who had at least 1 year in out-of-home child welfare placement. So we looked at 794 youth. And we wanted to study young people with substantially deep child welfare involvement. So having that 1 year of out-of-home child welfare placement is really a group heavily involved in the child welfare system. And again, just to note that this was a sample all prior to CYPM kind of involvement in Pittsburgh. So we used trajectory analysis to identify distinct groups based on juvenile and criminal justice system involvement from ages 12 to 22. And so the 5 groups are categorized based on level of justice system intensity, as well as the ages in which the contact occurred. And I'll note now that for the percentages in each group, I apologize that some of the numbers are a little bit mislabeled. So if you hear me reading numbers that don't match those on the bottom left, here are the ones and those are the correct ones, I promise you. The good news to take away from the pie chart is that the majority of youth, so over 70%, had little to no contact with the juvenile or criminal justice system from ages 12 to 22. So if you were following along with the beginning, this is very consistent with prior research that shows about 30% of kind of youth overall get involved from the child welfare system into the juvenile justice system. But the converse of that is that over 70% of child welfare involved youth generally don't get involved with the juvenile or criminal justice system. So the early age group, this correct percentage should be 5.9%. There was an early age group that had peaks of this juvenile justice system contact around ages 15 and 16, and then it decreased. There was a late adolescent, early adult group, and the correct number is 7.9%, that began justice system involvement around ages 16 and 17, and then had these peaks around ages 20 and 21. There was a group of short-term, highly involved youth that was 7.8% of the overall sample that had brief but high probabilities of involvement in the juvenile justice system between ages 16 and 18. And then there was a chronically involved group, and the correct number is 7.7%, who had high probabilities of justice system involvement consistently across ages 12 to 22. So in the next slide, I'll give a breakdown of how those 5 groups, kind of how they varied in their juvenile justice system involvement, how those 5 groups listed in the pie chart compare on their mental health services involvement. We also had data on these youth's involvement in public mental health services and looked at 7 specific types of services, and those were crisis, family-based, medication, partial hospitalization, outpatient, inpatient, and intensive case management administration. And so based on these, we constructed what we call the service intensity score by summing these factors. So the scores range in severity from none at 0 to high, which was 7. And so the chart at the bottom shows the average service intensity score for the full sample of 794 youth, and that was 2.6. And then the columns to the right show the average service intensity score for each of the 5 justice system subgroups from the previous slide. So for example, the no-low justice system group, that group that didn't really have any significant involvement in the juvenile justice system, had a mean mental health service intensity score of 2.62. And the average mental health service intensity score was significant across the justice system groups. So this means that there were statistically significant differences between the justice system groups based on mental health and service intensity scores. And to note that the 2 groups with the highest mental health service intensity scores were the early age justice system group, so they had an average score of 3.4, and the chronic justice system group, which had an average of 3.31. So this suggests that crossover youth with involvement in the juvenile justice system at relatively younger ages, and that those with consistent justice system contact are receiving more mental health services than the other subgroups. So they may have greater mental health need, and hopefully this indicates that appropriate services are being provided. This kind of information can be beneficial for targeting services to those with the most need. So also, given that there are limited resources of any kind, this information can be helpful in helping us determine who to prioritize when it comes to mental health services.
So as Karen alluded to before, I'm going to discuss the Crossover Youth Practice Model, or the CYPM, that was developed at Georgetown Center for Juvenile Justice Reform back in 2010 and has since been implemented in over 100 counties in 23 states. The purpose of this initiative is to change how systems handle dual system youth by increasing collaboration between agencies in order to better the outcomes and experiences of these young people and their families. So the major goals of the CYPM are listed here and include reducing the number of young people placed in out-of-home care, including congregate care. This is a dominant focus of the model because we want to keep kids with their families or relatives whenever possible, and we want to ensure that family-find services are being used exhaustively before placing youth out of home. Additionally, youth who enter congregate care tend to experience frequent placement changes, which can hamper their abilities to form connections with other people and can disrupt their education, among other things. Kids in congregate care and other out-of-home placements also face higher likelihoods of arrest. Another major tenet of the model is to reduce the overrepresentation of youth of color in both the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, and Karen described the importance of this earlier. An exact statistic is not known nationally, but some studies have found that African American youth double in rate within the crossover population compared to their prevalence in just the juvenile justice system or just the child welfare systems alone. And finally, the CYPM works to decrease the number of young people who cross over between systems in becoming dually involved by emphasizing prevention. So the CYPM utilizes a three-phase approach that is meant to address various components of crossover cases, and it informs how systems interact in order to improve communication, collaboration, and service provision. Phase one of the model focuses on how to prevent young people from crossing over, how we identify them when they do, and reducing the utilization of and extended stays in detention. Phase one begins when a young person crosses into the juvenile justice system from child welfare or vice versa, although, as I mentioned earlier, the latter is more common. And when this occurs, a system that has been put in place between juvenile justice and child welfare enables the identification of a young person as an individual known to both systems. Once the case is flagged as a crossover case, caseworkers and/or supervisors from both agencies will convene to discuss the young person's history and relevant assessments in order to make a recommendation to the court. Decision-making regarding charges should be a collaborative process. Although we certainly acknowledge that young people should absolutely be held accountable for their actions, we also certainly advocate the importance of courts being informed of the young person's history in order to understand the whole child and not just the charges that are before them. So looking at phase two focuses on collaborative assessment and planning, regardless of whether the case gets dismissed or moves on towards adjudication. Through the CYPM, jurisdictions are encouraged to create a one-judge, one-family model so that both their child welfare and justice cases are handled by one judge for crossover cases, or jurisdictions may create a crossover docket where a group of judges and magistrates are dedicated to overseeing all crossover cases on both the child welfare and juvenile justice sides. This enables judges to have a more well-rounded understanding of the youth and families involved in their courtrooms, and it also eases some of the stress that families can experience as a result of having multiple court appearances. During phase 2 as well, direct care workers from juvenile justice and the child welfare systems convene to establish a joint case plan based on the sharing of information collected through various assessments conducted by either agency. Members of other agencies, such as behavioral health and education, are also encouraged to participate in order to create an actionable plan and to identify the most appropriate services for that young person. And finally, phase 3 of the model focuses on the enactment of the case plan through coordinated case management involving both or all relevant agencies. Usually one agency will take the lead on case management while holding the other agencies accountable for their parts. So one benefit of this structure is that communities can maximize the resources that each agency has so that there aren't redundancies and so that there's clarity with the family about who is doing what and when. Oftentimes, jurisdictions will implement or utilize a multidisciplinary team meeting, or an MDT, or family team meetings to ensure ongoing communication and collaboration by caseworkers and service providers on a regular basis. Also, if communities already have an existing meeting structure, we at CJJR will work with them to utilize that instead of creating something entirely new. It's expected that case managers will also work together well in advance of case closure to develop a realistic plan for permanency and transition so that young people and their families are prepared with skills that will foster self-sufficiency. And finally, I really can't emphasize this enough. It's extremely important that young people and their families be at the table for these meetings whenever possible, as they are most certainly the top stakeholders in all of this. The jurisdictions that use the CYPM are instructed in how to collect data in order to document what their systems looked like before and after the implementation of the model, as well as to make key decisions about how their systems need to adjust in order to better serve kids and their families. Based on this data and some studies that have been conducted by researchers at Cal State LA, the University of Minnesota, and the University of Nebraska Omaha, a number of CYPM outcomes have been documented. This includes reductions in recidivism, new sustained petitions, and pre-adjudication detention in the justice system, as well as a reduction in the use of APLA or another planned permanent living arrangement such as foster care. There have also been increases in improved educational outcomes, engagement in pro-social activities, behavioral health, the use of diversion, and young people being placed back with their families in safe environments, as well as improved availability of social supports through things like mentorships and permanency packs.
So next is an example from a specific CYPM jurisdiction that I currently work with. So this is in Prince George's County, Maryland, and for those unfamiliar with this location, it borders the eastern portion of Washington, D.C., so it's the D.C. metro area. So they began their CYPM collaboration with Georgetown in 2013 and implemented the practice model in 2014. And they've served as a model for CYPM implementation in the state of Maryland and have been great to work with regarding continuously monitoring and evaluating youth outcomes. And just as kind of broader context, in part because of the great work Prince George's is doing, that the state of Maryland itself is adopting crossover youth practice model and implementing it statewide kind of gradually. But the piece that I'm going to highlight here involves improvements that Prince George's County made regarding effectively addressing substance abuse issues among crossover youth. So youth were assessed at 9 months after they crossed between the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. So as part of our CYPM data evaluation and tracking, we monitor youth kind of at the point of being identified as a crossover youth, so that point in which they switch between the two systems, and then 9 months after they've been identified as a crossover youth. And so youth, we had a group of youth who were tracked before CYPM implementation in the county, and then also compared that with a group of youth who experienced crossover after CYPM was implemented in Prince George's. And then we compare these two different groups of youth, kind of those pre-CYPM youth and then the post-CYPM youth. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the great work that they're doing in Prince George's related specifically to substance use. And so what we found was that in our evaluations, post-CYPM youth had better outcomes, than the baseline or pre-CYPM youth in terms of improving substance abuse issues. So we had 18 kind of baseline or pre-CYPM youth and saw 25% saw improvement in substance abuse issues. For the post-CYPM group, of which we had 28 youth, and this was comprised again of youth who were crossed over between that first year of CYPM implementation, 51% of those who had substance abuse issues saw improvement. And so we're continuing our data collection to specifically address this need more and more. So having this type of data collection and ongoing evaluation really allows us to sit together at the table in Prince George's and to make sure that we're continuously improving services specific to substance use in this county. And so I think this is really a great way, a great example of how youth outcomes can improve when there is better coordination and communication between these multiple systems that youth are involved in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kolovsky and Dr. Miller, for sharing your expertise and knowledge. If you have questions, we'd like for you to post them in the chat box at this time. We had a question from Stan about the accessing of tutoring services. I think that was related to the LA case study. Dr. Kolovsky, would you like to address that question?
Sure. So I think it's a great question, and the short answer is related to tutoring is that we don't really know, because I don't think this was specifically addressed in that study. It was just kind of a question of whether or not, we don't really know this yet among crossover youth. So some of this is driven by the data that we collect, and I don't believe the data captured kind of what were the reasons why this was the case. And I could always go back and kind of look at it again. But really it's kind of driven by we just are getting into deeper knowledge about crossover youth. And so for me, this is just very exciting because in terms of kind of academic kind of educational outcomes, we know that they're generally bleak for crossover youth, but we don't always know kind of tutoring. So even to have this question, for me as somebody who kind of followed the development of crossover youth research, that was pretty exciting in and of itself. So unfortunately, the state of the research is that it's still pretty much in its infancy of not getting into further about why, like whether this was, as you kind of mentioned in your question, driven by them not being provided adequate services, being a child and youth not necessarily kind of following up into those. But kind of just I would infer based on kind of what we know about crossover youth in general is that they tend to fall between the cracks and not always get their services needs met. So if we think about kind of the life of a youth who's involved dually in child welfare and juvenile justice, a lot of times this involves kind of movements amongst not just kind of places that they're living and living situations, but also professionals who are coming into their home and they're going through a lot of different assessments and different people. I remember when I was doing interviews with youth aging out of foster care, they weren't always even aware of what systems they were in. They just more kind of operationalized it as, well, Alex is my worker who comes once a month and talks to me. So I think there's just a lot of gaps we just don't know in knowledge about kind of if it's something related to systems not providing enough resources or if it's children, youth, and families not kind of following up further.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kolovsky. We have a couple of other attendees that are typing.
So while they're typing, if you, go ahead. I was going to keep talking.
No, go ahead.
So I was going to, the other thing, just as I was speaking when Stan had asked that question, was related to kind of mental health services as well. And again, I think some of this is just we don't really know because the research hasn't addressed it yet. So a lot of times it's driven by the types of research that we're doing and the data that we're collecting. So a lot of the studies even that I'm reporting on in this presentation have to do with administrative data, and that's all the data that gets entered in computer systems kind of as you're doing your daily work, but it's not always data that's specifically collected for the purposes of asking these kind of great questions. And so I think that just really speaks to the need about where the research needs to go with crossover youth. So I'm excited to have this dialogue because it helps give us, Alex and myself, some ideas about kind of these gaps that we need to address.
And Karen, actually, just to even build off of that, I think with regard to identifying, the needs of crossover youth and this population more generally, a lot of it boils down to a lack of information sharing between systems, and so oftentimes we'll find that systems may not even know that youth who they're working with are in fact crossover youth. And so with that, there's, as Karen mentioned before, there's a lot of gaps in service or gaps in communication, and so it becomes kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what these youth need or what their families need when we don't exactly or always know who they are.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. We have another question from Kala. What are some of the priority research areas in better understanding the needs of crossover youth?
Alex, do you want to go, or would you like me to go?
I'm actually just kind of mulling over, so priority research areas. Well, I mean, I would say as a whole, we need to know more about the characteristics of this population, but then I think we also need to kind of get into the nitty-gritty with, for instance, what are their experiences with education? You know, oftentimes these kids are moving around quite frequently, and so are they experiencing multiple education placements? Are they dropping out of school at higher rates? With regard to that, these are characteristics, or rather demographic information and experience information that we just don't know. But Karen, what would you add to that?
So I would like to add that this is my career goal, so this could be a long answer to a short question, but I'll be brief. Yeah, I think there's so much that we don't know yet, and kind of as you mentioned, Alex, there's a lot of directions that we can go. One of the areas that I personally am really interested in is what is it about child welfare system experiences itself that make a youth more likely in some ways to move from child welfare to juvenile justice. So I think a lot of times research focuses on maltreatment, so focusing on abuse or neglect, and of course those are very important factors to address. But I think I'm just intrigued sometimes by, okay, so the youth has already been traumatized, they enter into the child welfare system, and we're a system designed to really kind of protect a youth and really nurture them and make sure they're having positive outcomes. Well, this isn't always happening for all youth, and so kind of looking at kind of where are those gaps in kind of service provision for youth while they're in the child welfare system that we can help strengthen to then hopefully reduce the likelihood of a young person entering into the juvenile justice system. So, for example, out-of-home placement. Out-of-home placement is a very good thing in terms of providing safety and well-being for youth involved in child welfare, but we also know that that can be a traumatic experience in and of itself. So in addition to a young person already coming to the table with that maltreatment kind of history, now they're being removed from their family of origin, which again, a lot of times this is very necessary due to safety reasons, but at the same time can also be very frightening as well. And so are there ways that we can kind of examine the factors within the child welfare system to kind of improve it so that youth have better outcomes? The last thing I would just add is the need to really have more input and resources and amplifying youth and family voices. And so a lot of times what's missing in the research is kind of that direct interviews with young people who are involved in these multiple systems. And in part that's because they can be a very difficult population to kind of access. Kind of people do age out and kind of move around. But at the same time, I feel like that's a gap that we really want to make sure and address. And to kind of give credit to the crossover youth practice model. So obviously Alex didn't have the time to kind of get into all the details, but one component of it that they really focus on is making sure that youth and family who have experienced multiple systems are part of the table, kind of coming together and having these discussions about, it's not just professionals talking about what it's like for youth experiences in these systems, but also people who have experienced these systems directly themselves so that they can say, okay, this is what it looks like from my perspective. And I think that's just something any of us as professionals want to keep in mind to make sure that we're having the voices of those who are trying to serve at the table as well.
And Karen, just to echo you, I know this question was specifically about research, but you know, as you just mentioned, it's just as important that we have youth and families at our tables at all of these meetings when we're making, you know, both policy decisions and decisions about their specific cases, because they are the key stakeholders, and if they don't buy into the process, or if the process doesn't work through their lens, then it's not going to work at all. And so it's really vital that we have them at the table, and that it's not just that they're at the table, but that we're actually acting on what they're saying.
Absolutely. So we have a comment from Desiree. I agree that it is helpful for judges and all parties involved to have information about the youth and not just seeing charges and making decisions based on charges, but collaboration and data is everything. So thank you for your comment, Desiree. Stan has another question. Did any specific actions evolve regarding trying to correct disproportionate minority representation?
Alex, I'm going to hand that to you to talk about with CYPM, if that's okay.
Yes, of course. So that's a great question, Stan. And on the whole, it's kind of hard to come to an aggregate determination on that. It really does depend on each jurisdiction. And so we've had jurisdictions who have looked at their pre-CYPM data, and they've noticed that, wow, we really do have disproportionate minority contact. What is it that we can do? And so some of the things that have changed as a result of that have been training or have been increased diversion opportunities for this population. We've also had jurisdictions look at other overrepresented populations, such as LGBTQ youth. As Karen had mentioned earlier, they are also overrepresented. So it really does depend on the jurisdictions and what they are seeing in their data. And from there, they make decisions using the model and with our support in order to tweak the system that they have intact.
We have another comment from Stan, and while Stan is typing, I'm just going to go to contact information. If you'd like to reach out to Dr. Kolovsky or Dr. Miller, their website is here, www.cjjr.georgetown.edu. And so we really appreciate you facilitating our webinar today, Dr. Kolovsky and Dr. Miller. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with our learners today.
Thank you so much for having us. Yes, Alex and I love talking about this all day long. So yes, I agree. And thank you to the comment about data is everything and sharing, because yes, we're all about collaboration, because the only way we're going to address this population is if we coordinate our services and bring our data and information to the table.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much.
Yes. And the slides are available to download at the bottom of your screen, and we will be sending out a link of the webinar to the attendees. And please complete our survey. We'd like to know what topics you're interested in and how we can make our webinars more interactive and relevant to your work. So thank you again to our facilitators, and thank you to the Institute for your assistance with the webinar. Have a good afternoon.